Disclaimer, this video was made before any balance changes. A lot of these items probably will be changed in future patches, but that has not happened at the time of recording. Number 10, Bolstering Lantern. When below 50% health, receive a damage increase of 20%. This item is pretty much only here because it was grandfathered in and didn't make the cut in the worst items list. It's not the worst item in the DLC, but I certainly would not call this a good item. In the worst items video, I talked about why I dislike items that require you to take damage. I feel like it kind of goes against the ethos of the game. The game should reward you for not getting hit. This item is arguably an even worse offender than Noxious Thorn and Antler Shield in that regard. Those items can work kind of passively, but this one requires you to stay at 50% HP, and maintaining that consistently is pretty hard to do, not to mention incredibly risky. If you're trying to use this with Delicate Watch, you have to stay between 25% and 50%, which is a pretty tight margin. At the end of the day, it's still a 20% damage boost that multiplies the value of all your other damage items, and it has a pretty nice synergy with Genesis Loop. The effect itself isn't awful, it's more so the way the damage boost is activated that's the problem. The only exception to this is self-damage Rex, since you play at 50% HP most of the game anyway. On everyone else though, it's a pretty difficult one. I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here, but I absolutely cannot stand the art direction of this item. In a vacuum, it looks okay, but stylistically, it's very different from every other item. Usually, the higher the item's tier, the more complex it is. Notice how most of the white items have very simple designs. It'll usually be a basic shape with 2 or 3 colors. This is good because they're tiny little icons at the top of your screen. You can tell what they are at a glance. Bolstering Lantern has this incredibly intricate design that's far more complex than every other item in its tier. Granted, this is a nitpick, but every time I look at it, it drives me crazy. Number 9, Chronic Expansion. Every 5 enemies slain grants a damage counter bonus, increasing the player's damage by 10% plus 5% per stack, lasting as long as the player stays in combat. That's the logbook description, but there's actually a few inaccuracies in there. Firstly, this is a 6% damage boost, not a 10%. I guess they just rounded up, so I don't know, that's fine. The bit about it deactivating while out of combat isn't really true either. It's not like Red Whip, where activating a skill puts you in combat. You actually have to go around getting kills. This item is kinda in the same boat as Bolstering Lantern. Both items increase your damage in a weird way, and both have the same problem with art direction. I don't think it's quite as bad on Chronic Expansion, but I still don't think it really fits. As far as a method of activation though, this item is a pretty big step up from Lantern. Getting kills is something you'll be doing anyway, so you don't have to try very hard to get the damage boost outside of just making sure you're not waiting too long in between kills. In the early game, it's not the best because there's often long lulls between enemy spawns, and keeping the stacks up consistently is pretty hard to do. But the longer your run goes, the more viable this item is. After a certain point, enemies are everywhere and you don't have to wait for them to spawn in. Unfortunately, this is an item that doesn't work well on Mithrix. You can maybe eke out a little use in phases 2 and 3, but unless you have a Forgive Me Please, maintaining stacks just isn't going to happen. Speaking of Forgive Me Please, you can basically do infinite damage if you have a fuel cell and a soulbound combo. It's very busted, but it doesn't influence my opinion very heavily because that's not something that's going to happen extremely frequently. I don't have a super strong opinion on this item. It's very middle of the road for me. It's one of the better items in the expansion, but it's also not crazy. It just kind of exists. This video is sponsored by Cook Unity. Food. Some people eat it, some people eat too much of it, and some people don't eat enough. Some food is hot, some food is cold. When you really think about it, what even heckin' is food? Is it worth the hype? Well, don't ask me. Ask Iron Chef Jose Garces. Just look at that smile. Cook Unity is the first chef-to-you meal delivery service platform, delivering freshly prepared, pre-selected meals right to your door every week. This is a great service. I love food, but I'm a horrible cook. I get impressed with myself every time I manage to not burn cereal. This often leads to me turning to fast food, which isn't great for my body or my wallet. But Cook Unity offers the convenience of fast food combined with the craftsmanship of a top-tier restaurant. Meals come pre-cooked, all you gotta do is heat them up. It's so easy, even an old fart like me can do it. No matter your taste or diet, Cook Unity has it. It's honestly a little intimidating picking the meals because there's so many good options to choose from. It is a subscription and it's very easy to skip weeks or cancel if you want. My favorite meal is the mission-style burrito from Jose Garces. I mentioned him last time, but I have no idea what kind of voodoo magic he's putting in these. The flavors just come together so nicely. I highly recommend this one. I also really like the barbecue chicken bowl from Chef Ruben Garcia. and the beefy baked mac and cheese from Chef Chris Rattle. Cook Unity has dozens of chefs offering a wide variety of cuisines. Select from a whopping 350 plus meals each week, or if you don't want to do that, Cook Unity is happy to select meals based off of your taste preferences. Go to cookunity.com/disputed50 or click the link in the description below and use my code disputed50 to get 50% off your first order of Cook Unity meals to try them out for yourself. Now back to the video. Number 8, Seed of Life Consumed. On activation, places a sprout that drops healing orbs. Okay, so here's the thing. I usually separate items and equipment into different videos, but seeing as this expansion only had 17 items and I talked about 10 of them in my last video, I had to get a little creative. So I'm including Seed of Life and Seed of Life Consumed because they have completely different effects. Seed of Life Consumed is actually a pretty good equipment. It has the lowest cooldown in the game, tied with Wood Sprite, and is a very similar equipment to that one in a lot of ways. Both have really short cooldowns, both can heal you, and both can heal other players or drones. They're extremely similar. The main difference is Seed of Life requires you to pick up healing orbs, where Wood Sprite is more passive, but both are extremely easy to use. Another difference is obviously the method of obtaining them. You can only get this equipment by dying with the Seed of Life. If you want, you can just eat the deaths, you can skip straight to this equipment. It's probably not the right play, but you can do that if you want. The only tricky thing about that is if you have watches or elixirs, you'll break them, so I definitely wouldn't recommend that in most situations. I think the only time I'd really do that is if I wanted to take advantage of its low cooldown, if I had something like Bottled Chaos or Warhorn. Both those items synergize really well with this equipment, and I really like how this item was implemented. I often talk about how adding new items to the game inherently makes other items more rare, and because there's so many bad items in the DLC, you just generally get worse runs now. Having this equipment be obtainable through another equipment remedies that to a certain degree. Instead of adding 2 equipment to the pool, you're only adding 1. I don't know how intentional this was, but I think it's pretty cool. Now, I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't mention that this equipment has the ability to teleport you across the map. Yeah, so basically, for some reason, whenever you use this item, for 1 frame, it teleports you to the location you put the seed, and then in the same frame, it teleports you back. Now, normally, you wouldn't notice this, but if you aim this somewhere out of bounds, the game will think you fell out of the map and will teleport you to the closest node. The uses for this are pretty limited. It's most helpful for traversing the moon. It's just a funny little bug. You can actually pillar skip with this if you have a Ball of Chaos and roll an egg. It'll just teleport you to whatever location you're looking at, and the egg somehow bypasses the TP back in the same way being out of bounds does. Very niche, but it's still pretty cool. At number 7, Chance Stall. 20% plus 8% a stack chance to get higher rarity items from chance shrines on success. This is wrong, it's actually a 40% chance with an additional 10% every stack. One of the rare cases where the description actually understates an item's effectiveness. It happened. I finally get to talk about an item I genuinely love. This is a really cool one. It makes shrines a lot better. Just having one of these makes greens more common than whites, and it makes it 5 times more likely that you'll get a red from a shrine. There's also supposedly a 0.2% chance you can upgrade a red into a yellow item, but I tested this for like an hour and a half, and I could not manage to make this happen. I'm under the impression this is bugged or the wiki is just wrong, but I don't know. If you've gotten a yellow from a chance shrine, please let me know in the comments, because I could be wrong, I just haven't seen anyone that's been able to get it yet. One side effect of this item is it actually decreases your chance of finding an equipment in a shrine, and if you have 7 or more stacks, it's actually impossible to get one. It makes sense just due to the way it works, but it is kind of unfortunate. I love everything about this item. It interfaces with the looting part of the game in an interesting way. It's not the most useful item in the world, and it's an easy scrap on stage 5, but who doesn't like finding more reds? Chance shrines can be really tedious sometimes, and Chance Stall just makes them that much more interesting. Great item. At number 6, Electric Boomerang. 15% chance on hit to fire an electric boomerang that travels a short distance before returning, dealing 30% damage and stunning all enemies on hit. Another one of my favorite items in the expansion. The damage on this item isn't amazing on its own, but it's redeemed by being a proc machine. It has a 1.0 proc coefficient and hits multiple times. If you have a few bleed stacks, this is really noticeable. Other proc items like ATGs, Polyloots, Stickies, you know them. They're all really good with this. Its physics are identical to Sonorang's as well, which is really cool because Sonorang has some really unique tech. You can get saws/boomerangs stuck on geometry when returning to you, and they throw out a constant hitbox. A while ago, I discovered you can actually do this in Phase 3 of Mithrix to apply hundreds of bleed stacks really quickly with Saw, and you can now do this with Boomerang as well, which is awesome. Speaking of Boomerang, currently there's a very strange but cool bug where just having the equipment in your inventory will give Boomerang a 100% bleed chance, even if you don't have any daggers. This basically gives you an instant bleed build if you're playing a proc survivor like Commando or Captain. On other characters though, it's not the greatest. Slower attackers like Loader and Railgunner don't get nearly as much use out of it, but that's alright. It's still a really good item, and I think it's worthy of being a red. To be honest, I just like that this item can saw tech. It's really fun and definitely a good pickup. And number 5, Seed of Life, revives the user when killed or dead allies on activation, consumed on use. This is functionally just a Dio's best friend, but in the equipment slot, it's kind of like an aspect. It's mostly passive. You can only activate it in a regular way if you have a teammate that's dead, which I really like about it. I think the hardest thing about multiplayer in this game is that dying can be super punishing. If you die, you fall behind on loot, and since the scaling is increased a lot in multiplayer, you're really at a deficit when you spawn in on the next stage, and that often just leads to you dying again, and then you just spiral even further. So having a way to bring your teammates back to life is really nice. I think this is something Gearbox recognized, and there's now 3 ways to bring your teammates back to life in the expansion where there were 0 before. Although this technically isn't a part of the item, there's an incredibly overpowered interaction with Bottled Chaos. If your teammate has it, they can roll Seed of Life and revive you, and because it's from a Bottled Chaos, you can basically have infinite lives, just as long as the person with Bottled Chaos stays alive. This item isn't exactly the same as a Dio. Engineer's turrets can't utilize it, unfortunately, but unlike Dio, it's also useful beyond activation. When you use it, it's replaced with the Consumed variant, which I've already talked about, but it just gives this equipment a bit more versatility. While having an extra life is obviously really good, there's often situations where you're better off taking a damage, economy, or mobility equipment, especially if you're heavily invested in watches, and nothing really beats a recycler. That said though, it's still a really solid equipment, especially in multiplayer. And at number 4, Long-Standing Solitude. On level up, gain a free unlock for the next purchase, but all gold is converted into experience. Anything that costs gold is increased by 100%. If you saw my worst items in the expansion video, you would know I put this item as the worst item in the expansion. I was wrong about this. I made a correction a few days ago. If you didn't see that video, here's a rundown. I thought this item was bad because level ups in Risk of Rain 2 happen very slowly at a certain point. You need 18 quintillion, 500 quadrillion XP to reach level cap, which is pretty much impossible under normal circumstances, and in a regular run, you don't get very far past level 40. While this is true, what I didn't understand is that this item completely changes the fundamentals of the level up system, making each level require the same amount of XP regardless of how high it is. Going from level 1 to level 2 is just as easy as going from level 93 to level 94. This item makes reaching level cap possible even within the first loop, which is pretty insane. This lets you deal about 3 times as much damage and have 3 times as much HP. It does come at the cost of items depending on when you get it. If you get it in the early game, it can make your run harder for a while, especially if the loot you're getting isn't the best. I would go as far as to say having some economy items is pretty essential if you want this item to work well. Those items being Roll of Pennies, Gore's Tome, and Brittle Crown. If you have any of those items, this is easily one of the best pickups. If not, it's a little more iffy. I think this item has more potential than the next 2 items on the list, but I also think it's a bigger risk and isn't as universally good, so that's why it landed at number 4. Number 3, Sail Star. Gain an extra item on the first chest opened per stage. While I don't think this is the best item in the DLC power-wise, I think it's by far the best designed and is certainly my favorite. This item hits in all the right ways and creates some super interesting decision making. Getting 2 or more items out of the first chest you open really makes you think about looting. Do you forget about it and end up with 2 bison steak, or do you open the big chest and hope for the chance at a red? Maybe the better option is going for the equipment. This item will give you an exact duplicate out of an adaptive chest, so do you scout the map for that? This is the perfect example of an additive item to the loot pool. Again, expansions run into the issue of diluting the loot pool. You gotta be very careful with the items you add, because if an item is dead weight, that not only is boring, but it negatively impacts every other item. There are multiple ways to go about this. One really good way is by creating a separate item tier where you get the item in different ways. The best examples of this are lunar and void items. They operate independently of the regular loot pool. Another way to balance this is having overlapping effects. The best example here is Mocha. Even though Survivors of the Void made hooves and energy drinks more rare, speed as an effect isn't. You can also have additive items. These are items that take up a slot in the loot pool, but make up for it by allowing you to use them to find other items. Some good examples of this is Rusted Key, Shipping Request Form, and Regen Scrap. Sailstar is one of those, and is one of the few items in the DLC that manages the loot pool well. Get the hell out of here, Sonorous Whispers. Don't worry, you'll get your turn. Sailstar is so well thought out though. It was pretty much the only item that was revealed pre-release, and I think it's pretty clear why. Just a super solid item all around. At number 2, Runic Lens. Overspill, 5% chance, plus 1% per 100% done on initial hit, plus 1% per item stack on hit to summon a meteor on the target, dealing 2000% damage, plus 50% damage per 100% damage done on initial hit, plus 50% damage per item stack. Whoa. Yes, my favorite Risk of Rain 2 mechanic, Overspill. Huh? You never heard of Overspill? What, you've been living under a rock? Overspill is a mechanic that exists for this item and this item alone, where the higher the attack's damage, the more likely it is to proc, and it also receives bonus damage depending on how much more damage your attack did. This item is incredible. Even if we disregard Overspill and just look at the base proc chance, 5% chance to deal 2000% base damage evens out to a 100% damage increase. But in reality, it can be even more effective than that. Remember that bands multiply their damage by the damage of the attack that procced it, so proccing one ice band off this would be 5000% of your base damage. Obviously, you're not going to hit this every time, and the meteor isn't 100% accurate either, but it still hits often enough to be pretty game-breaking. This is a game-winning item in my opinion. I think it might even rival Head Stompers. Even on Commando, who doesn't benefit much from Overspill, it's easily a top 5 red item. What's more, this item can actually proc into itself, not directly, but if it procs something like an ATG, that ATG can then go on to proc Runic Lens again. It only has a 0.5 proc coefficient, so it's unlikely, but it is possible. Items are not supposed to do that, so this has gotta be a bug. This item synergizes really well with Chronobauble, and even better with Tentabauble. Unfortunately, it does have an anti-synergy with Knockback Fin, so if you needed another reason to hate that item, there you go. Unfortunately, its main weakness is its accuracy. It really does not deal well with flying enemies, and it can be pretty easy for enemies to move out of it. Like I said though, it hits often enough to offset this to a certain degree. I think this item is also a bit lacking in the effects department. It's not super clear when this item is proccing, so hopefully that's something Gearbox takes a look at. Super amazing item, but as good as it is, it can't beat the GOAT. And I'm of course talking about our number 1 spot, Sonorous Whispers. When a large monster is killed, it will always drop an item. All elites have a 3% chance to drop an item. Pre-patch, this was hands down the best item in the game. On release, it was a 15% chance to drop an item from an elite, and with the nearly doubled elite spawn rate bug, this was definitely an experience on day one. Now spoiler, this is still the best item in the game, especially if you know how to abuse it. The fact this makes large enemies drops items alone is enough to put it in S tier. Large enemy just refers to bosses, not necessarily the teleporter boss, just those types of enemies. Beetle Queens, Vagrants, Grandparents, those guys. So you're already getting extra items every teleporter event. It makes Mountain Shrines that much more worth it as well. It's essentially Artifact of Sacrifice, but as an item. If you wanted to, you could probably just stay on one stage forever and outscale the enemies. I proved this over 4 years ago with the 24 hours on stage 1 video. Maybe it's time to revisit that, I don't know. From my experience with that at least, the game will get to the point where all it will spawn is large enemies, at which point it's going to be even better than Sacrifice. Now, while you could just sit on a regular stage and farm this item, there's a much better way to do it. There's currently 4 stages in the game that spawn enemies but stop the timer, those being Void Fields, Gilded Coast, Prime Meridian, and the Artifact Reliquary. The Reliquary is disabled in Eclipse, but the other 3 are fully accessible. Of the 4, the easiest to farm is probably Gilded Coast. With Void Fields, you have to deal with the fog, and while Prime Meridian does spawn a lot of elites and large enemies, meteors rain down, and it's an extremely dangerous stage. Regardless of what you pick though, you can just stay there for as long as you'd like and get as many items as you would like without scaling the difficulty at all. You could have over 1,000 items, technically 20 minutes into the run. The nerf didn't really impact this. Yeah, the drop chance is lower, but all that really means is it will take longer. And when you're in a place where the timer literally stops moving, it doesn't matter. The only thing stopping you is how long you want to torture yourself. This is by far the most broken strat we've ever seen in this game, and it doesn't even require artifacts. And for that reason, Sonorous Whispers is the best item in the expansion, and the best item in the game as a whole. Pretty crazy to think this item was released alongside War Bonds. Alright, that's going to be it for today's video. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like. It really does help it in the algorithm, and it's very appreciated. I've been on a bit of a hiatus recently. To be honest, I just haven't been super motivated to play or make content for the game. I don't want to blame Seekers too much for that, but it certainly was a factor. I'm back now, and I have some ideas for how you can keep things fresh and interesting on this channel, so subscribe if you want to see that. I want to give a big shout out to my editor Kami for working so fast on these last 2 videos. They really are a legend, as well as Rainy, my Discord mod, for keeping that shit show together. If you want to join, there is going to be a link in the description. It is a little bit cringe though. Both these guys help me out so much behind the scenes, and I'm very grateful for both of them. I'm also grateful for our members. If you want to get some exclusive emotes as well as have your name at the end of these videos, click the join button. It really helps out the channel. All right, that's all. Have a good day, everybody.